afternoon. It's an absolute privilege for me to welcome all of you to the CPR seminar room, and most importantly to welcome Professor Jan Werner Müller to deliver what promises to be both a riveting and very, very relevant talk titled, "Is Populism Still Defeating Democracy?" It's an absolute pleasure for us to have you here at CPR, so thank you so much for making time during your trip to do this. We're really looking forward to this. By virtue of introduction, Professor Müller is a professor of politics at the Princeton University from 1996 until 2003. He was a fellow at the All Souls College, Oxford, and from 2003 to 2005, he was fellow in modern European thought at the European Studies Center, St. Antony's College. He is widely published and has written widely on democracy and political theory. Several in the audience are carrying copies of your latest book, Professor. I'm sure you're going to have to do a lot of signing right after. So really looking forward to this. His History of Political Thought in the 21st Century Europe Contesting Democracy was published by Yale University in the summer of 2011. His book, Was It Populism? Sorry, I'm going to pronounce this all wrong, but excuse me about that. What is Populism? Populism was published in April of 2016. The University of Pennsylvania Press brought out an American version in the September of 2016, and that's the book that's in various people's hands for you to sign today. So with that, over to you, and thank you again for being here. Take this on, so you just have to be within the range of this microphone.
So this is my first time speaking in India. It's a great honor to do it here. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks also to Pratap Mehta, who cannot be here this afternoon, I understand, but who was absolutely instrumental in making all this happen. Now, I think as everybody in this room knows, the past few years have seen an absolutely inflationary use of the word populism. And by now, I think, the fact that pundits, some politicians, God forbid, even some policy scholars and political scientists, are constantly telling us that we live in the age of populism. Because of that, I think we now have a tendency to stick the P word onto all kinds of phenomena for which we actually have much more precise concepts. Just to give a couple of random examples, think of nativism, nationalism, protectionism, racism, plenty of other policy choices one could think of. So partly for that reason, I want to start us off with my proposal as to how we should think about the phenomenon of populism, and give you what I think is a relatively parsimonious way of understanding it. In the second chapter of my remarks this afternoon, I want to move on to what I tend to call the populist art of governance, which is partly a way of pushing back against those, and there are plenty of those out there, who would argue that virtually by definition, populists are incapable of governing and governance. And then thirdly, if I may, I just want to offer some tentative thoughts about some developments we've seen in, let's say, the last 2 or 3 years, both in terms of populism supposedly being on the losing side politically in some contexts, but then also some perhaps not so hopeful lessons about how one could possibly push back against populism, also drawn from the last 2 or 3 years. So first chapter, what is populism anyway? Of course, the conventional wisdom is that those who, as the phrase goes, are against elites or those who criticize or hate the so-called establishment are populists. When you think about it, it's actually a very peculiar thought. Up until even a few years ago, any sort of person in civic education would have told us that being critical with the powerful is actually a sign of good democratic citizenship. And all of a sudden, in the early 21st century, we're constantly told that those who have a problem with elites or somehow populist who are somehow dangerous for democracy. Clearly, things cannot be as simple as that. It's true that populists basically oppose those who are in government when they are in opposition. But what they also do, and this for me is crucial, is that they claim that they, and only they, represent what they very often call the silent majority, or also very typically, the real people. Now, to some of you this might not sound so bad, this might not sound so obviously dangerous for democracy, but it does have two consequences which indeed are dangerous for democracy. First, and perhaps rather obviously, populists are also going to claim that all other contenders for power are fundamentally illegitimate. This is never just a disagreement about policy, or even a disagreement about values, which after all is completely normal, ideally even somehow productive in a democracy. But that's not what populists do. In a sense, they immediately make it personal, and they immediately make it entirely moral. What they in fact tend to claim is that the others are simply, to coin a phrase, crooked characters. What Trump did in the 2015-2016 presidential election in the United States, and then to some degree again in 2020, was of course extreme by many standards. But it was not truly exceptional. What he did is, that's my proposition to you, what in one way or another all populists are going to insinuate. The others are simply crooked as in corrupt characters. So far, so maybe obvious. The second implication is perhaps not so self-evident. It's that populists will also imply that all those among the people themselves, all those citizens who do not agree with their symbolic construction of the supposedly real people, that all those who do not fit that or who don't agree with it, on one level do not truly belong to the people at all. Trump is again maybe an obvious example. You remember how often he would respond to critics of certain policies, let's say. Not by doing what any quote-unquote normal person in government would do, which is to say, look, we're elected, we have the mandate, these are the policies, you might not like them, you get another chance to vote us out. Well, maybe in Trump's case, maybe not. But, there will be another election, you can judge us then, and here are the reasons why we're doing what we're doing. Of course, that's not what he always did. In fact, that was relatively rare. In a sense, a much more telling response was to basically immediately say, the critics are un-American. In other words, the tendency to reduce political disagreement to questions of belonging, with the implication that some don't belong at all, not all citizens are the real people, or perhaps some people are at best second-class citizens. Maybe you can think of other examples from other parts of the world where one sees this kind of pattern. Long story short, what I'm proposing to you is that populism is not primarily, or is not best understood as a matter of anti-elitism. All of us can criticize the powerful, it doesn't mean we're right, but this is not in and of itself dangerous for democracy. What is crucial about populism, and indeed dangerous for democracy, is anti-pluralism. The tendency to exclude others. Pretty obviously at the level of party politics. All the others are corrupt characters. Less obviously in many cases, but much more dangerously, at the level of the people themselves, where usually already vulnerable minorities are decreed not to be truly part of the people, alongside all the critics of the government. End of first chapter. Second chapter. It's very often said that almost by definition, populists cannot govern. Why? Here's one argument along these lines. Very often people, I dare say people who one in the broadest sense could call liberals, tend to say, well, look, populists, they're all against elites. Once they are in government, they are kind of the elite. So they cannot possibly go on being populist because they will be criticizing themselves. It would be completely contradictory kind of stance. Or, variation on this theme, also very popular with liberals in the broadest sense, populism is by definition about simplistic responses to what, of course, we all know is a highly complex world. Hence, as soon as they get into power, their policies will be exposed as naive, they'll all be seen as incompetent, all their followers will realize that what they promised isn't really working out. Either the failure is so obvious that they change course, or they will basically be voted out soon enough. And as some of you will recognize, as a kind of footnote, this is on one level a version of the old moderation through inclusion hypothesis. You kind of take rebel riders into government. They really have to become pragmatic. They have to fill potholes. They can't do crazy ideology day and night. So they're going to adapt, become reasonable, and if they don't do that, they'll be out soon enough. I belabor these points because they remain very widespread as conceptions about populism in government, and you will have noticed that both these arguments basically imply that, quote-unquote, the problem will solve itself. Either they become pragmatic or they'll be out, but not too much to worry about. Of course, these assumptions are largely false, and we've seen, I'm not telling you anything new, plenty of examples, plenty of regimes in our world today where we have populists in government and populists who seem to be sustaining themselves in government for extended periods of time. And that's partly, this is my second major proposition to you, because they by now have developed a repertoire of governing techniques that basically help them to stay in power. For the purposes of this afternoon, I'll just pick out two elements. There are other ones as well, which I'm happy to talk about later, if you wish. One of these elements is that populists in power would essentially try to appropriate the state, which is basically shorthand for saying they're going to try to fill what in theory should be neutral bureaucratic civil service positions with partisan actors. Now you're going to look at me and say, well, come on, so many parties try to do that. That's not uniquely populist, there's always a temptation to do that. Of course, you're right. The difference is that the populists, of course, assume, if you find my argument plausible, that they and only they represent the people. So, who does the state really belong to? Well, the people, of course. So, filling state positions with populist partisans is not something illegitimate or something that even has to be hidden. It's something that can even be defended in a certain way. And you won't be surprised to hear that all more or less independent professionals, be it judges, be it journalists, be it inspectors general, you name it, can all be dismissed as illegitimate in the name of this claim, that they don't truly represent the real people. In fact, they're obstacles to implementing the will of the real people. So that's one element. Another one, and again I have a feeling that I might not be telling you anything super new in this context right here and right now, is that when there is not even resistance, but something like pushback, opposition to populists in government, especially from, let's say in the broader sense, civil society or other independent institutions, populists very often will push back very, very hard against that opposition, even when their power isn't really in question. Why? Again, in my view, it has something to do with the underlying assumption. Again, if you find my approach plausible, they are saying that they and only they represent the people. Then, by definition, it cannot be true that there are people out there who are protesting against them. It can't really be civil society. It can't really be, genuine members of the real people. And by now, of course, we all know the playbook of how you then unfold a series of claims. What you basically see out there on streets and squares protesting against the government of the real people are not real citizens. In a certain way, they're fake citizens. Why? Well, we all know the answer. They're, of course, all financed by, the usual suspects. The CIA, George Soros, but there are no limits to creativity. Some of you may remember the Gezi Park protest in Turkey, 2013. Soon enough, somebody from the Turkish government came out and said, look, you think this is genuine Turkish society protesting against what's happening around Taksim Square? Not at all. The answer was obvious about what was really happening. It was, as I'm sure everybody in this room already knows anyway, it was the German airline Lufthansa who was organizing everything. Why? Because Erdogan was, of course, also building this fantastic new airport. And Turkish Airlines was going to be the greatest airline in the world, as Morgan Freeman was also telling us on all these front page ads in the New York Times. So the evil Germans were basically creating fake citizens to, push back against this fantastic plan. Whatever looks like genuine protest is never genuine protest. Whatever looks like citizens having a problem with the government is never real citizens. I'm partly belaboring these probably pretty obvious points to also link up to a perhaps not entirely obvious point. By now, this populist art of governance, this, if you like, repertoire of techniques, is, so to speak, internationally available. And it can be copied across borders. And it's not rocket science. Somebody figures out how to basically craft what can seem like a facially neutral law, but it's something that can then very easily be weaponized against, let's say, NGOs and think tanks, be it via taxation, taxing foreign donors. I mean, there are no limits to creativity how you can do it, but once you figure out how you do it, it's very easy for others to say, okay, that's now in the playbook, and we'll try to do it as well. And I think that, in an interesting way, sort of basically pushes back against an illusion that I think many people had in the 90s. Not that history had ended. People either didn't really understand what Fukuyama was saying, or they didn't really believe this anyway. But I think there was another very prevalent thought in those days. Namely, that for all their faults, and for all the mistakes they make all the times, democracies have, in a certain way, an epistemic advantage. We are the learning system. Yes, we screw up, but we can admit mistakes, we can correct mistakes. Basically, I think this deep-seated assumption was that authoritarians or aspiring authoritarians can't really learn, can't correct mistakes, and they're all going to end like the Soviet Union in 1991. I really think this was a kind of assumption in the background for many people. And I'm by no means saying that today's authoritarians or today's populist regimes are invincible. We shouldn't go to the other extreme and now, attribute sort of magic powers to them. That's not true either. But I think there's still a kind of tendency sometimes, partly linked to the point I was trying to make earlier, that they can't really govern anyway, that leads people to say, okay, they're going to founder sooner or later. And of course, whenever there is now an incident where it looks like this old theory is confirmed, so Putin doesn't really understand what's going on. Nobody dares to tell him the truth about the state of his own army. Nobody dares to tell him the truth about how the war is going. Xi Jinping doesn't really understand what's happening with China, and so on. People kind of almost have a sense of relief and say, it's confirmed again that sooner or later they're going to screw up in certain ways. And maybe they will. I'm not an astrologer or do any predictions of that sort. But after what we've seen in the last 10 to 20 years, I think we just can't afford that kind of complacency. And we just have to assume that a lot of these actors are pretty good at learning from others and copying across borders in certain ways. All right, let me open the last chapter, and then hopefully we can also have a discussion. And obviously, be happy to hear pushback against any of these, wild generalizations across countries, continents, and so on. So let me, if I may, say a couple of words about what has been happening in the last 3 or 4 years or so. So I think some of us in this room are old enough to remember a time when, again, plenty of pundits, and again, dare I say, some social scientists, were saying, okay, the pandemic, it's the end of populism. They're all going to screw up, again, based on this idea that populists are the great simplifiers. We, of course, we understand the complexity of the world. They don't. This is a highly complex challenge. It's only a matter of time before those populists who are in government are going to fail in one form or another. As hopefully has become clear already, the assumption that the best way to understand this phenomenon is along the lines of, they are the great simplifiers, is a mistake to begin with. A perhaps less obvious mistake in terms of all these sorts of predictions, I think, was that basically populist parties, movements, leaders were treated as a kind of homogeneous phenomenon. And this was partly because, as you all know, also in the last at least 6 or 7 years, a certain image or metaphor has taken hold that is regularly evoked by people who offer public affairs commentary. And that's the image of the wave. So the supposedly unstoppable populist wave, or as Nigel Farage, who apparently felt that wave was too small an image given his own world historical role, once put it, the tsunami of populism that is going to wash away elites everywhere. I think that's a highly misleading image. It also has, I think, detrimental normative consequences. It's empirically misleading because at least in Western Europe and North America, I'm not talking about other parts of the world, and I grant you that Italy might be an exception to what I'm about to say, but with these exceptions, to this day, no far-right populist has actually come to power without the, and I use this term consciously with all its historical connotations, without the collaboration of much more established conservative or sometimes so-called mainstream right-wing parties. So to suggest that it's a sort of autonomous and, as the metaphor of the wave implies, kind of unstoppable phenomenon, fails to see this dynamic, that it's actually always a coalition. And this gets me to my normative point, there's always somebody who basically decides that it's acceptable to form a coalition or to collaborate with, in this case, far-right populists. And if one simply keeps talking about the wave or tsunami, one doesn't see that, and maybe even more perniciously, it plays into what at least I see as an increasing political defeatism among nominally mainstream center-right actors. Because after all, hey, if it's an unstoppable wave, what can they do? They have to adapt to it, they have to go along with it in a certain way. And what we've seen in many situations in the past few years is what some of our colleagues in political science, I think, rightly have described as the mainstreaming of the far right, which is a little bit different from saying, oh, everybody's becoming a populist. Not all these quote-unquote mainstream center-right actors are populists in the sense of saying only we represent the people. That's not what happened. That's not what's happening. But many of them are adopting a rhetoric and sometimes even policy positions which are distinctly far-right. So just one example that some of you may remember to illustrate this point. At least for some of us, it was a real shock when in February 2022, Valérie Pécresse, the main candidate of the French Republican Party, which is to say the old center-right Gaullist party, so as mainstream as it gets in the French context, basically stood there and repeated/legitimized the theory of the Great Replacement. In other words, the conspiracy theory that says somebody is sending Muslims to Europe to replace the real people who, of course, are white Christian, take your pick of how you want to describe them. So that's not populism, but that is a kind of mainstreaming of the far right. And that is something, of course, that also once you've done it, you can't undo. You can't next day go back to your voters and your followers and say, sorry guys, I learned overnight that it's a conspiracy theory, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, strike it from the record. So you can't do it. Once it's done, it's done. So I think that's partly what is bad about this kind of transporting that operates with images like the wave, tsunami, and so on and so forth. But the larger point is that to homogenize this phenomenon is a problem. And there are probably plenty of people in the room who study comparative politics, so I'm telling something totally blindly obvious when I say that it is still very important to pay very close attention to different national contexts. But that's one reason why all these wild generalizations about what the pandemic was were clearly wrong to begin with. Now, some of you might come back to me though and say, well, wait a minute. In some of the world's largest democracies, populists actually were thrown out, partly as a result of how they dealt with the pandemic. Trump and Bolsonaro, TB for shorthand, are excellent examples of saying, look, they completely failed in dealing with it. Doesn't that sort of prove this expectation that they had highly simplistic ideas of how to respond to this? My answer to this is that even though they got the most attention, of course, from journalists and concerned citizens and social scientists, they are simply not typical of what has been happening in the past few years. Which is not to say that there aren't lessons from these two cases, but I think they're a little bit different ones than sort of wild generalizations about what is happening with populism. They're actually more structural in a certain way. What do I mean? in certain ways, both these examples, I think, are yet more sort of grist for the mill of those scholars who have a certain suspicion of presidentialism. Because these actors could do something, and they did something, that to some degree does actually conform to the kind of liberal expectation of a populism in government that I was kind of poo-pooing a little bit earlier on. Since both Trump and Bolsonaro were basically faced with hostile legislatures, and since both Trump and Bolsonaro were operating in federalist systems where they could sort of talk against some of their own governors in the country who had different ideas about what to do about the pandemic, they could sort of basically be in power and kind of play opposition at the same time. Which again, I think is not something that always happens with populists, but since they, and this is more idiosyncratic, and I think it's not unkind to say this, since both of them were not terribly interested in policy questions to begin with, since both of them also had not large-scale experience in how you handle an administrative state, it was much more likely that they were going to default into doing the thing they were always doing while running for office and even in office, which is basically all-out culture war, and to try to redefine the pandemic as somehow a matter of belonging, being a good American, the MAGA hats came out, you're freedom-loving, or you're not, etc. So they, in a sense, both had the temptation of simply doing culture war, but there were structural conditions as well for them that were simply not there for other governments. And maybe in addition to that, another structural factor that makes these cases exceptional is that both of them had very peculiar relationships to political parties. So Bolsonaro, you may remember, has cycled through, if I remember the number correctly, at least 8 or 9 parties. And there was a time when he was president and he didn't have a party at all. Trump, of course, sort of the opposite case, you might say. At least for a while, we can debate to what extent this is still true now or not, but for a while at least, he seemed to have transformed the Republican Party into a kind of personality cult. Now, even though these two cases are so different, basically no party or a party that seems totally subjugated, the outcome, ironically, is the same. In both cases, you don't have a political party that can restrain the leader, either because it's a personality cult or because there's no real party at all. So hence also nobody around to really say, look, we have to deal with this differently, and we can't simply do crazy culture war. We actually have to respond to this in certain ways. So I think this is what makes these two cases somewhat peculiar. There are plenty of other examples of populists in power who may not have been terribly successful in what they were doing, but they were certainly doing more than simply culture war. Unlike what some colleagues in political science have sometimes suggested, which is that, populism thrives on crisis, so they want to prolong crisis, they want to keep in crisis mode. I think this was simply not true with the pandemic. This was simply not the kind of crisis that really lent itself to a particular populist form of politics, so whoever could really wanted this to be over as soon as possible. Some populists, of course, were still punished for what they did. Most obvious recent example, you might say, is Italy. So Salvini, you may remember, was joining the coalition, this very large coalition with Draghi, very technocratic in a certain way. He does get punished at the next election. Giorgia Meloni kept out of all this, and very old political science story, of course. Okay, people feel bad about what happened. They still want to vote for the far right. Here's Meloni, who's innocent, didn't do anything. She gets the votes. Salvini loses half his votes. Not a surprising story, really, not a really surprising outcome. But all of which, a long-winded way of saying, let's be careful with these generalizations about what's going to happen with populism, and let's maybe shy away from this, you might say, in and of itself, ironically simplistic understanding that populism is always clearly just a matter of simplistic ideas about policy, whereas we, of course, understand complexity and so on. I mean, maybe you do, I'm just saying for myself. I would never go around and tell people something like that in this form. So that's one thing. And the last thing I want to put on the table, also maybe for the sake of discussion, is more in relation to what can those do who are faced with populists in power, and especially with populists in power who use this basically playbook of populist art of governance, who are entrenching themselves in power in certain ways. Have we learned anything over the last 10 years or so of what strategies might be successful or not. Now, I wish I could end on a sort of uplifting note, especially if you are kind enough to bring someone from the US. I think it's always a reasonable expectation. Say something positive at the end, But I worry that, unlike with the authoritarian playbook, we don't have anything that looks like here are 10 bullet points, and this is what you have to do, and this is how you defeat them, and so on. And I think this has partly something to do with a very particular dilemma that I would like to put on the table, and hopefully we can have a chance to discuss. Here's what I mean. So on one level, it seems very clear, almost conventional wisdom, you might say, that opposition parties, if they want to have a chance to win against populists, especially against populists who are already busy gerrymandering, rigging the playing field, and so on, they have to unite. Most people would, from the get-go, say this is an obvious implication. Okay, so put aside ideological differences, put aside policy differences, unite against the populist environment. Problem with that is that then the only reason why you're uniting is because you're against person X or party Y, which is another way of saying it's all about person X and party Y. And of course, in highly polarized situations, that's exactly the game that party X and person Y want to play. And by now, we know from the work of some colleagues in political science, I'm thinking in particular of Milan Spolik, that it's not true that those who vote for populist parties are all deluded, or they don't know there's corruption, or has never occurred to them that some of these figures are damaging democracy. But as soon as populists create a situation of it's us or them, and especially, of course, if the them are endangering the country, our fate is in danger, and so on, very many people, not all of them, but at least some of them, it seems, are willing to basically overlook the damage to democracy and say, look, I'm still going to go with this person. Again, it doesn't always happen. Some people, of course, wanted to draw a very uplifting lesson from the midterm elections and say, well, sometimes at least, people actually do seem to care about democracy. And it does seem to make a difference. Which on one level, is an empirically, I think, plausible point, except if one thinks about all the Republican congressmen who got re-elected, even after what they did on January 6th, which is not to say they all went for the insurrection, but they basically still said, okay, we're going to basically oppose the outcome, and we're going to still perpetuate the story. Maybe not so clear-cut as an uplifting lesson. Anyway, the problem is simply, if you unite, you are, in a sense, not on your own playing field. You are playing their game. And I think by now we have at least a few examples where we've also seen that the kind of next step that opposition parties then sometimes take, which is to say, okay, let's basically react to their success with offering something that actually in certain ways looks somewhat similar, but that is different from them because it's more pro-democratic. That might not always work. What do I mean? Think of Turkey in 2023. Some of you may remember that there's now something called the Table of Six, which is basically all the opposition parties minus the Kurds who are already out of the game, it seems, who are trying to choose a candidate to run against Erdogan. And at least for a while it looked like, okay, we're going to choose somebody who, you'll be shocked to hear, is male, conservative, older, religious, and nationalistic. In other words, Erdogan who is not Erdogan. Or think of Hungary last year, when many people had hopes that, okay, maybe Orban has run out of luck. Somebody was chosen, and I don't mean to ridicule this person at all, but somebody from the countryside with as many children as possible, 7 in the end, somewhat conservative, Orban who is not Orban. Didn't really work out. So the lesson one could seem to draw from this is, okay, uniting against person X and party Y is not enough. You are kind of playing their game. And this kind of mimetic strategy, kind of copying them in a certain way, maybe is also not a great idea. So, what should you do instead? Well, maybe you have to change the parameters of how people talk politics and talk about different issues and do something differently, which, for many of us might seem like an attractive proposition. But, and here's the dilemma, if that then is the instruction, you can't paper over ideological differences so easily. If you're only against person X, you can say, set aside our party programs, it's all about defeating these people. If that isn't good enough, and you somehow have to do something more substantive, then all of a sudden you're back to ideological differences. So think of another example that has been very much in the news. People are now asking, how should opposition parties in Israel position themselves? And already you see people saying, well, we're all very worried about this government, but we're not sure we want to work with the Communist Party. We're not sure we want to work with the party, that sends Arabs to the Knesset and so on. So this is, I think, an incredible dilemma. I'm probably, again, not saying anything new, but if, somebody could tell us how we can address this successfully, I think we would, have made significant progress in how we think about these more strategic / tactical issues. And again, I underline that because the sort of, comfortable, to some degree complacent view that, this is sort of going to solve itself sooner or later because of policy issues, simply, I think, is an unreasonable expectation. So I'm sorry that I really didn't finish on an uplifting note, but there's some time to discuss, and I look forward to exchanging thoughts and some pushback as well. For now, thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think there's so much in what you said that rings true and not true, both true, but also speaks to our own lived experiences, and I think helps us try to make sense of the particular moment that our own democracy is going through. And I think there is a lot to make sense of, but there's also, I guess where I land on how you're thinking about it towards the end in your final chapter, I wonder how much of how we are understanding the phenomenon of populism needs to also be anchored much more firmly in the social transformations that are creating these. So what is it about the internal dynamics of society, which in some ways is, if you think about the big Indian conundrum, right? Democracy is thriving if you look at it from the point of view of how many people go out to vote, but if you start digging deeper to say, is this genuinely representative? And to me, even more sharply, where is it that people are placing their anxieties, aspirations, expectations of the state and applying pressure? It's actually happening outside of the formal democratic process completely. What is that? How do these dynamics play out in thinking both about understanding why we find ourselves in this populist moment in the first place, but also the longer term question of strategically then, how do you build out opposition? Because the second question that's been on my mind is that if we think about challenging the populist movement entirely on the back of strategic alliances, without getting to the heart of the social context that have thrown up these populist moments, you may end up actually deepening the problem, even if you get short-term relief. And when I think about the United States, I know relatively little about it, but as an outsider, when one sees what's going on, it is true that there has been a momentary breather, but those very forces that created the phenomenon of Trump and the phenomenon of populism still seem to be alive regardless. So how should we think about that element of it? And I think the Indian case complicates this even more, because it is anchored also in an ideological project that has been consistently part of a social contestation and cultural contestation in India. So just some thoughts from my end to kick us off, but open to everyone. How would you like to, should we take a few responses and then
you run the show. I would just suggest that if people want to sit, there's still seats here,
Oh yes, sorry. There's one here, there's 3 or 4 this side, so go ahead, Mujib.
Professor Mullah, it's absolutely fascinating to listen to your analysis. I had the pleasure of reading this book almost a year and a half ago when I wrote a paper on this, so I haven't been able to go back to it. So based on your, I completely agree with you, and I like the term wild generalizations about this, the use of this particular term, which in a way looks like a shapeless hat, like you throw it on anybody's head and they say, well, this is what it is. So it's hard, like Martha Nussbaum compared Trump with Modi, beyond a point, like it's difficult to compare. So I was wondering, as a student of political theory, if I ask if there is a global fatwa, academic fatwa, that don't use the term called populism, use something else, invent something new, what would be your suggestion for that? A complete new term that you'd like to have to explain the different kinds of cases that you have cited. My second question is this, the bulk of your talk...
Because that's not difficult enough.
The second question is the bulk of your analysis, the way you presented, is all connecting the right-wing ideology with populism. And I would be interested that in what sense that one could be able to reflect on the left-wing side of it. Because two particular attributes that you highlighted, one is the failure in governance, for instance, or in a manner that you deal with opposition, for instance. So if you look at post-revolutionary regimes, in the end they all failed and collapsed. I'm talking about the socialist societies. We describe them in glorious terms that they were revolutionary, but forget about that. And obviously none of these regimes had opposition within them, because they are all one-party states, right? So I was wondering that, can we trace this term and use it, and can we draw some insight and make some sense of it? Thank you.
Rajshri, and then we'll take you. And what I'll do is we'll stop after your question and then we'll come back this side of the table in the next round. Go ahead, Raj.
So this is piggybacking actually on his question.
Sorry, Rajshri, I'm going to ask you to just take the mic so that, because it's being recorded.
Okay, so is this good enough? Yes. So piggybacking on his question, query, intervention, I actually am a political scientist. I teach political science here, and some of my recent work is in rule by law and the making of authoritarian democracies. I was recently last year in Vienna at the IWM. I was on a visiting fellowship, and there were a couple of other people, one being a German, Johannes Wolz, and the other Martin Krieger. And there is a marked preference for the use of word populism. And each time I come back here, there is a general sense of unease about the term populism. My sense is that it perhaps has something to do with the kind of socio-economic milieu that we are located in, where populism does not necessarily have a pejorative content. It may actually have a welfarist or even a social democratic content. It could be leftist, it could be right-wing. There is nothing which actually, there is nothing which is pre-implied in a sense by the term itself, so there is an unease about the term populism, and which is why I prefer to use the term authoritarianism, because there are just so many bypassing of democratic projects, democratic norms, and democracy itself. A second quick point about populism, or what I prefer to call authoritarianism, is the marked is a glaring project which completely subverts the rule of law project, which is one of the foundational ideals or the foundational pillars of democracy itself. And the manner in which the rule of law project of liberal democracy has actually been converted and subverted into a rule by law, where law actually becomes a technology of control rather than a check on arbitrary power.
Yeah, if I can just sort of, again, picking up from this whole definitional question that's being raised. So, the idea of what would the term be if it was not populism versus preference of using authoritarianism. Another term we hear often in the Indian context as well as majoritarianism. So how would you distinguish one from the other, populism versus authoritarianism versus majoritarianism? Is there a religious undertone? Is there an economic undertone? I mean, what is distinguishing these terms as well?
that's a really important point, because in the past, in the Indian context, we used to use in public discourse the word populism all very often to refer to a kind of politics that responded to the needs of the majority of the people as opposed to the needs of the elite.
Good evening, sir. My name is Arman, and I'm a second year student at that university. Very interesting discussion on populism. My question essentially flows as a corollary to the idea of othering you spoke about initially, and also as a corollary to the remarks ma'am gave, the idea of social contestation undergirding the idea of populism today. Now, what seems to be happening, if one is to go by your argument, sir, is that what was essentially a revolt of the masses seems to have been co-opted and captured in the mold of what seems to be a revolt of the elites. So even if you look at the situation in India, the Modi regime was the result of an ideological project which began as an upper caste project. But today, if you look at voting patterns, you see that a lot of the voting percentage comes from Dalits and from the lower castes. And despite the fact that the ideological project, which the current government stands for, started as a primarily upper caste one, and that is also true of the kind of support the Trump government got from certain lower communities in the US. So my question really is that the way these new elites have mechanized elections what seems to be happening is that they've managed to convince the masses that the revolt of this new elite is indeed the revolt of the masses. And this conflation has been very craftily carried out. So what I wanted to ask you is, to what extent is this a result of something very pathological within the psyche of voters, and especially voters who belong to a marginalized or a lower section of society? And to what extent can this actually be ameliorated? Can this sort of can there ever be a reconciliation of the kind of oppression which they've faced and how they express it on the ballot?
So we have about 5 hours left to address all these very simple, straightforward issues. Yes. All right. So first of all, thank you. Really very good, which is of course to say difficult issues to tackle. You're of course right to take me to task for basically only having talked about the what and not the why. But on one level, there's a reason why I didn't talk so much about the why, which is that some of you might widely disagree with this. That contrary to those, again, very often liberals in the widest sense, who basically say, you know, give us the one macro cause which is going to explain all this globally, ideally 140 characters or less. I think I'm not asking a reasonable question. Which is not to say everything is mysterious, or we can't understand anything, or we couldn't see certain patterns. But anybody who says, oh, it's all globalization, or it's all racism, I think it's just absolutely implausible to try to capture what is happening sometimes in very, very different contexts, where very different coalitions come together. It's clearly not the case that it's always the worst off who vote for these kinds of parties. It's also not plausible to say, oh, there's a neat division between the so-called cultural and the so-called economic. Of course, very often they're bound up with each other in certain ways. So I know this sounds incredibly pedantic, but I think we need much more fine-grained stories about what has been happening in different countries. Even if, and again, of course, you don't have to buy my sort of conceptual handle on this, even if the outcomes look similar. Although, maybe note also that the outcomes partly might be looking similar because of this mutual learning. So the fact that something looks like a similar pattern in terms of governance does not mean that the root causes are identical. It can also mean that actually, oh, we figured out we can do certain things this way, and we can learn from those who've already done it. So again, it's very important to kind of look as closely as possible in different contexts, which I know is a very unsatisfying answer, but I think at least as far as I'm concerned, it's the only honest answer to this. And the kind of, oh, it's all this or it's all that is simply not possible. I take your point that the word populism also has very different connotations in different contexts. And as you all know, also in the United States, it's often seen as a good thing, going back to the 19th century revolt by farmers and workers, Main Street against Wall Street. Of course, I don't decree how we use language. I sometimes, though, find it hard to pin down what those who, for instance, say, oh, the Democratic Party should have a more populist agenda. I'm not really sure what that is supposed to mean, other than you do something good for, workers, service workers, and so on. But shouldn't you be doing this anyway, as a kind of centre-left party? So if it's just a shorthand for social democracy, I don't really see, what it does. And if it's simply shorthand for popular mobilization, well, presumably all parties are kind of interested in this. If it's simply, concessions to popular culture, that's what some of our colleagues think too, that this is about breaking taboos, talking like the common man, whatever. Okay, but I'm not sure this gives us much of an interesting conceptual handle, plus it also doesn't generalize across a number of cases. So I take the point that it can be misleading to use the word in the way that I'm using it, that people can rightly say, well, look, I'm thinking of something different for historical reasons. Political languages are different. We have to work with our inheritance in certain ways. But what I would insist on is that populism is really different from authoritarianism. And that we, at the very least, to be clear, have to say something like authoritarian populism, or if you prefer, populist authoritarianism. You can be an authoritarian without ever really invoking an idea which I think is also indispensable for populists, which is that the people are ultimately right. And you, as the leader, are there to implement, the genuine popular will. Which, of course, doesn't mean you always do what the majority wants. I mean, there are plenty of examples where you do something different. But then it's the old Jean-Jacques Rousseau idea. There's the general will, which is, what the people would really want. And there's the will of all, which can be mistaken. So as long as you make, open that division, you can actually do something different, but you would never deny that the people are ultimately right. But you can be an authoritarian and not make this claim. Think of, 20th century, let's say, Latin American bureaucratic authoritarianism, the military. Military didn't say the people are right. People are irrational. They go for crazy communist ideologies, etc. We have, great technocrats, we'll fix it, etc. But you don't have to talk about the people at all, other than in some totally paternalistic, we'll do the right thing for them, and so on. Or since you asked about revolutionary regimes in the past, a Leninist, is also pretty anti-pluralist. But a Leninist, of course, would never have said the people are right. I mean, the people, come on, they're hopeless. Even workers are hopeless, as all of us still, familiar with good old Marxism-Leninism will remember. They will get at most to trade union consciousness, but without a vanguard party that takes the people to the right place, it's a hopeless case. So, that kind of anti-pluralist, that kind of revolutionary would never say anything, admiring about the people and so on. So that's why I think, I mean, of course, again, I'm not disputing your claims. I'm just saying there is a reason why I would like to hold on to the word populism, and then also in my understanding, because the link to the people and the claim about how you represent the people is crucial. And if you never talk about the people, I think there's a good reason to think that you're actually not a populist. You might be a different kind of authoritarian, you might be doing something different. Now, since you asked, what other word? I hate to disappoint you, but I don't have I always wanted to say this. I don't have anything like that ready. But I think maybe what was in the background of the question, maybe not, but it's something that I think we could also maybe talk about if you like, is something that, of course, has also been a very heated discussion, especially, but not only in the US in the last couple of years. And that is a discussion about the F word. So the question whether what we are seeing today is plausibly described as fascism, or as some of our colleagues would like to put it, neo-fascism, or not. Now, again, if you find anything worthwhile in my approach, then on one level it's obvious that fascists would have been populist in the sense of saying, only I represent the people. Even though, you might say, even the original case is more complicated, because Mussolini also had a king, besides him, which is one of the reasons why it was actually, in the end, surprisingly easy to get rid of the duces, so again, from the get-go, maybe more complicated. But not all populists are fascists, in my view. There is a kind of inbuilt authoritarian dynamic. This is why I was saying early on, it's damaging to democracy, but I would not say that populists are simply the same as fascists. Then again, we are seeing some phenomena today where you might say, well, look, this really reminds me of certain images from the 20th century. Most populists in government, I think, are very careful precisely not to produce images that too easily remind people of the 20th century. So they will allow a little bit of opposition. They will be happy if some journalists keep blogging, as long as there's nothing too scandalous on TV. They're very careful not to do anything that looks like outright repression, or will immediately make people, especially international audiences, think, oh, this is obviously dictatorship, and so on. Putin, of course, you might say, for a long time has been the exception. I think, in the early years, I think there was an attempt to play this game and to sort of say there is still genuine civil society, there is still one liberal newspaper, one internet TV station, and so on. As we all know, last year it was game over. It was very clear we're not even pretending anymore. We don't really care anymore also what the rest of the world thinks. So this would lead one closer to say, well, maybe we are seeing certain patterns which are more 20s, which are more 20th century. Two reasons to still shy away from that, and I'm putting it in a very short-hand way since we're in a lot of time and there are many other issues that are on the table. Two reasons to maybe shy away from that is A, that at least for me, fascism really at its core involved the systematic glorification of violence. So not just instrumental use of violence, but regretting it, but really saying this is the best human life. The best human life is a life of mortal confrontation and combat. Hence, not an accident that all fascist regimes, unlike authoritarian regimes, went to war sooner or later. I don't see this with a lot of the kind of characters, movements, and parties that I talked about. Again, you may come back to me and say, but look, isn't Putin different now? If you look at what's taught now in Russian schools, and what is said on TV and so on, maybe that has crossed the line. You'll be disappointed to hear that I'm not a country specialist for 180 countries or so I'm reluctant to, say in a clear-cut way, Russia is this or is not this, but I'm open to the argument that this really has crossed the line in certain ways. But in other respects, it's not plausible. The other, maybe less obvious aspect for why maybe fascism isn't a very plausible term today is that beyond the racism, which of course was also part of the original package and still is part of the package today, fascism had a very specific gender politics. And if you look at a lot of far-right movements today, it's very hard to say that this is simply a sort of repeat of the idealization of male brotherhood, as in what Mussolini called the trenchocracy, so the aristocracy of men who had bonded in the trenches of the First World War. If you read a lot of literature from the 20s, it becomes very clear that for some of these ideologues and activists, the best possible world is a world of mortal combat and a world without women. And again, you might find instances of this today. I'm not saying that there are no fascists in the world today, there clearly are. But in terms of a lot of the parties and movements that one would think of immediately today when one thinks of successful people who've come to power as, let's say, authoritarian populists, I don't think that's really part of the core promise. Again, I'm happy if you push back and say, but look, part of Trump and so on might be there, but not in the way it was for fascism. So this is my unsatisfying answer to is there a new word. Point about the rule of law. So I completely agree with you that, as also a number of our colleagues I think have rightly said, there is also now a distinctive playbook of what some people rightly call autocratic legalism. So again, this is part of basically not upsetting international audiences so easily. So do it slowly, do it subtly, do it in such a way that people can eventually figure out what's going on. So again, it's not rocket science. It's not like nobody could ever figure out what, forgive the Eurocentric examples, what Hungary and Poland were Hungarian and Polish governments were doing inside the EU. But while they were proceeding in decapitating their judiciary, changing media laws, intimidating NGOs and so on, and less obviously, basically feeding international audiences with bad faith exercising in comparative constitutionalism. So look, what we're doing exists in Denmark, and Denmark is above suspicion in terms of democracy. Look, what we're doing is the same in Norway and so on. By the time outside audiences have figured out how it really works, 3 or 4 years have passed. All your judges are there. Your power is entrenched. You've gerrymandered more, so it becomes increasingly difficult to undo things. So if it were totally repressive from the get-go, if there's violence on the streets, knocks on the doors late at night, again, everything that would remind people of the 20th century would be much easier. And this is something that I think has also become refined, which again is not to say they're invincible, but it's a way also of gaining time, which is always important. Point about majoritarianism. So this again gets us a little bit back to the question of what is a good concept. Of course, another one that hasn't been mentioned so far, but also very popular among plenty of our colleagues, is illiberalism or illiberal democracy. Right? We read this all the time. My worry about these sorts of terms, including majoritarianism, is that even though majoritarianism is better than illiberalism or illiberal democracy, is that I think it doesn't bring out clearly enough that it's really about genuinely damaging democracy. So again, somebody can innocently use, I think, the word majoritarianism when, for instance, they have genuine complaints about too much power for certain courts. So I think there can be good faith arguments where somebody says the Supreme Court in the United States is too powerful, or the German Constitutional Court is too powerful, or pick your example where you think that we should have more majoritarianism in the sense of trusting parliaments more. These are not arguments I would make, but when I read my colleagues who say these things, I'm not saying they're on the road to authoritarianism. They're not. They make certain assumptions, which I would share, but these are genuine arguments within democratic theory. Illiberal democracy or illiberalism is problematic because it basically concedes the term and ultimately the value of democracy to those who are really not Democrats or who are damaging democracy. Plenty of people by now even call themselves illiberal Democrats, and proudly so. And you can't please them more than calling them illiberal Democrats, because they're going to say, great, it's exactly what I want to be called. I'm an illiberal. I don't want any of that LGBTQI nonsense. I'm proudly illiberal in this regard, but thank you for leaving me democracy. Thank you for basically acknowledging that these are still free and fair elections, when even in countries where you might say it's still sort of free, it certainly isn't fair anymore. So I think you have to really bring out this sort of systematically anti-democratic character of some of these actors. Revolt of the masses, and so again, very good, i.e. very difficult question. I think you're absolutely right. So I would use the expression revolt of the masses, but if I understood you correctly, it's much more about saying, actually, what we really are faced with very often is not the masses against elites. It's one elite against another elite. And the counter-elite, so to speak, has become very good at mobilizing certain parts of the population. Now, the thing that I would concede, this also goes back to what you said at the beginning, is of course it would be crazy now to stand here and say, oh, everything that any populist leader has ever said is by definition false. Again, it's a little bit like, oh, whatever they say is simplistic. I don't think we can generalize like that. I don't think it would be fair to say whatever Erdogan, let's say, ever said about how a certain Kemalist elite in Turkey was viewing certain parts of the population was crazy. Or it would be crazy to say Venezuela was a wonderfully egalitarian country, and then crazy Chavez comes along and messes everything up. No. Of course, in plenty of situations, yeah, there is a hook, there is a way of mobilizing people. And of course, it's also fair to concede that sometimes how then existing elites respond to these mobilizations can cause a kind of fateful dynamic and actually, maybe lead to outcomes that could have been perhaps different. Who knows? I mean, I'm not the person to tell you whether Erdogan always wanted to be an authoritarian or not, whether Chavez always wanted to be an authoritarian or not. But yes, you can basically sometimes find the right kind of hooks, but you're also right to say that in many cases, not all of them, we are ultimately going to see a very peculiar coalition that in the US context, I think is rightly captured by the term plutocratic populism. So basically, culture war for what you call the masses, and actual policies for what is also, not to put a finer point on it, sometimes simply called the donor class. Now the interesting thing is that for all we know, this is actually not a successful coalition. This is actually not a coalition that can really consistently win elections, which is why the Republican Party basically has committed to a strategy that is based on actually not majoritarianism, but on counter-majoritarianism, on the assumption that unless we fiddle with the system, unless we engage in voter suppression, unless we capture the court, unless we do all kinds of things, we actually kind of know that this is not really a successful recipe. And this is not just my subjective opinion. Plenty of our colleagues would have said, look, if you actually talk to Republican voters and say, look, these are the actual policies. This is actually what is happening with taxation. People say, can't be true. That would be crazy. I would never vote for people like this. Which is not to say that everybody is stupid or totally deluded, but they kind of know that this isn't really something that people will go for. But since, as you all know, in the US we already have a lot of counter-majoritarianism built into the system, it's something that plenty of times, not always, can succeed. And I think this is sort of also why, again, if I may, this is also partly why majoritarianism maybe isn't the best term, because it does sort of, again, concede that, yeah, genuine majorities want this. But in so many countries, genuine majorities, they actually don't want this. BJP doesn't get 60%. Kaczynski doesn't get 50%. You know, some of these parties get 30%, 40% when they're in power, again, because they know that actually they are not super popular. They embark on the project of entrenching themselves vis-a-vis all kinds of other mechanisms that will basically make sure that actually genuine majorities can't really sort of go against them anymore. So again, I know this didn't really answer your question, but I hope it was interesting in terms of saying yes, there is something there, but I'm warning against the tendency to then say, oh, the masses are so deluded, because it can easily play. And again, forgive me for always beating up on the same group, this can easily play into a rhetoric which again has become popular among liberals, who after 2016 all of a sudden were like indulging in all the old cliches from like 19th century mass psychology, right? The people are so irrational, they're all waiting to be seduced by a great demagogue and so on and so forth. And in plenty of cases, this is simply not correct. It's simply not correct to say that majorities of people out there are clamoring for authoritarianism. It's not true. And again, that last point, that's also why it's so important not to concede the word democracy. Because everybody still wants to be seen as Democrat. Even in Beijing, today they want to be seen as the bad Democrats that will chaotic US and so on. So that would be my attempt at a response.
Thank you. I think we have a bunch of questions this side. So go ahead. We'll go from one.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Can I request you to keep your questions a little bit short since we're heading to 6 o'clock? So
I have two questions. The first question is, I'll put it simply, what are the economic roots of populism? I think this is what you can talk about it. And second question is very specific. I'm picking up on Yamini Meron's question of the social factors, the political demands of people. Labor market polarization is considered one of the causes of populism, and it is well studied in developed countries, but not so much in emerging markets like nil, minority. So what are your thoughts on that in emerging markets like India, Brazil, Turkey, labor market polarization?
Yeah, somebody here on this side, please go ahead. Yeah. Just switch it on from the top. Yeah, just
yeah, it just has to be green. That's yeah.
So I just want to add one point. Another significant demand is the cultural backlash theory that says that populists have strong demand amongst people to perceive that they are not really able to recognize their culture and national identities due to immigration. And so what's your take on this? This is my question.
Sir, I have a question and a small observation, please. My question is, I'll be very short, shorter than anybody. What could be the near future of populism in a world controlled by the sectarians, authoritarianism, and other authoritarianism? That is my question. Now, I am a student of comparative studies in the evolution of histories of all sorts, science and others, and the religion and politics and all. Taking that into account, what I have to state is this: the populists have been there ever since the dawn of human history. They have been there. They are there. They will be there, but they will never be in power. Because they have been in power. They are not allowed to be in power because they are always a minority. They are always acted as toothless bulldogs, and they are acting now, and they will continue to do so.
Yeah, go ahead.
At the outset, an apology, it might sound, it might lack the academic impersonality my question might lack. I'm Mondeep, I'm from Assam, and being from the northeastern part of the country, our politics has always revolved around the conflicts of identities. So in Assam, we have from the 80s, the whole politics has revolved around identities. In 2016 election, the BJP captured power by invoking the notions of indigenous identity. And by the 2021 election, it was molded into a form of civilizational clash. Now, my question is, what is the relation between the rise of populism and liberalism's apathy in recognizing these socio-cultural identities to extend it to national identities? While on my way, I was just reading Francis Fukuyama's Identity, and there he argues. He in fact invokes Plato, and he argues about megalothymos and isothymos. So, what's your take on that?
Thank you for a very illuminating talk on populism. I'm not going to ask you what I came to ask about the future of liberal arts education. But my question is, do you think it's a kind of a season for populism? Because after the Second World War, for decades it is either left or center-left regimes remained in power for such a long time. Not that they were a failure, but people just got bored with them.
Okay, again, very good, just to say difficult questions, and since time is short, you'll forgive me if I give relatively telegraphic answers. So first of all, forgive me, but I don't do predictions, especially not about the future. If you, again, find anything worthwhile in my approach, then almost by definition, populism is never going to disappear, because it's always going to be possible, as long as we live in representative democracies, for somebody to appear and say, I and only I represent the people. We can't sort of exclude that in some magic way. But again, going back to your point, of course, different conditions can make it more or less plausible for these people to get a certain foothold in politics, which goes to questions of identity, nationalism, immigration, and so on. So I don't agree with those who think that, oh, if you reach a certain level of diversity, or if there's too much immigration, then you're going to have populism. No, it's not as deterministic, as simplistic, as simple as that. I think it is probably correct to argue that if you do have existing fractures, let's say, or you have existing sort of patterns, materials, if you like, with which you can do cultural war, it's sort of easier. But again, it doesn't determine the outcome. So it was easier, again, forgive the Eurocentric example, for Viktor Orban to do what he ended up doing in the last dozen years or so by saying, look, here's a genuine, rural, deep Hungary, and here's a liberal, urban, cosmopolitan, we all know what that really means, kind of, fake Hungary. If the cultural materials are there, it's easy. But there are plenty of diverse places in the world where we don't see these sorts of outcomes. So again, it's much more about what individual actors do, what other issues are in play, how you politicize, and sometimes I think you even have what you might call outright polarization entrepreneurs. So the fact that now in the US everybody takes it for granted that yes, of course, flyover country, the Midwest is allegedly the heartland, real America, the coasts are so different culturally and so on, sort of overlooks the fact that, if I'm quoting this correctly from memory, more people voted for Trump in New York City than in both Dakotas combined. Again, I'm not saying it's all mysterious, of course you can tell, you can identify certain patterns, but the fact that this is now sort of taken as a given, as a plausible description of the country, is simply incorrect. Yes, it's true that basically all right-wing populists today are nationalists, but not all nationalists are populists. They don't all have to make these particular claims about how they relate to the people, and not all nationalism has to come out in this particular mode. Since some of you kind of also indirectly or directly asked about this, my point is not that all populism by definition has to be right-wing. There can be left-wing populism too. I kind of alluded to one example in our day, maybe the obvious one already. So Chavez is an example of somebody who basically said, okay, if you disagree with me, you cannot understand yourself as a proper member of the Venezuela that does socialism for the 21st century, and all these sort of initial things I was saying in terms of exclusions are also going to apply, even though basis than cultural or racist or religious criteria that others would invoke. One thing I'm skeptical about, but again, I'm not going to generalize about 180 plus countries. I'm reluctant to pontificate about this should happen in India or not. That's not my place. But I think one thing that has turned out to be somewhat dubious, again more on the level of strategy, is the notion that okay, if the left went back to genuine social democracy or even outright socialism, then lots and lots of voters would abandon far-right parties, which it is true sometimes have gone for a kind of welfare chauvinism that can look like it's a plausible substitute for old-style social democracy. If you think of one particular example where this was really sort of very clearly tried as a strategy, which I'm in France, 2017, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, France Insoumise. Basically, if you compare the 2017 presidential campaign by the self-declared socialist to the 2012 campaign, very stark differences. 2012, red flags, a lot of rhetoric that said everybody who drowns in the Mediterranean as a refugee is our concern. We are France, we are the universal nation. 2017, gone are the red flags. Tricolor appears instead. Lots and lots of nation-centric talk. And the hope was this is going to get us lots of voters to defect from what was then still the Front National and come back to a genuine alternative. What was the outcome? Again, if I remember correctly from memory, about 2% of Le Pen voters went this way. Not totally trivial, but given the hopes that had been raised, and given this somewhat simplistic idea that, oh, if you only offer them a socialist program, it'll all be solved, still a pretty damaging result. Now, one election doesn't prove, some large claim about strategy or democratic theory, but still not trivial, and actually, on one level, not so surprising, because when you think of the fact that, ever since the 50s, Lipset and others, we've known that there are actually plenty of workers who are very right-wing. This is not, you don't have a worker identity and hence you're automatically socialist. No. You get socialized into socialism or you don't. We shouldn't be, have this totally deterministic view that everybody necessarily, is deluded if they vote for the right. Plus, maybe less obviously, what always gets out of these very simplistic equations is that, of course, plenty of people don't vote at all. And it's those people who are, of course, very difficult to reach by now. But if you somehow manage to get them back into the game, as opposed to, oh, we're going to make all kinds of concessions to the right, and do a bit of nationalism, again, with so attend an illusion that you can control this, and you can turn it up or down, as you wish, which you can't, as the Republican Party in the US found out to its horror in the last 10 years or so, then maybe your strategy is very different than basically saying, let's kind of play their game to some degree. If I may, I'll say, in the last minute or so, I'll say something about what you kind of alluded to in terms of education, because maybe that's all the future of liberal arts education, because that's something that I think maybe is sometimes neglected as something very important in this wider context. Maybe doesn't apply to India at all. I'm happy if you tell me that this is really not a useful point here, but maybe some of you do find it useful to have on the table. So of course nobody's ever against education, right? The answer is always more education, and none of us ever says it's the wrong idea. But I think one unfortunate development has been that genuine civic, which on one level is genuine political education, has been under so much pressure from two different directions. The one is, of course, that if you do it genuinely, it's difficult and time-consuming. So it's not just about imparting knowledge. We have the following branches, and this is how you vote, and whatever. You actually, as John Dewey famously said in his books on education and democracy, people need to practice this. They need to do it in the school. They need to experience the school as a site where you kind of do certain things, which basically also goes to the Fukuyama point about, okay, we have certain passions, and there is a place for passions in politics. It's not true that, it's either technocratic democracy or it's crazy populism, irrational, and so not at all. But it's something you kind of get used to and practice and so on and so forth. But it's very time consuming. So in an age when people constantly tell us, look, all this pressure from China, science, technology, we really have to kind of, increase skills. People, of course, if in doubt, say, we don't have time for this. We can't have these endless exercises in democracy in schools. It's too time consuming. So let's just do here the branches and here's how you vote and so on. So that's one thing that's very unfortunate. But the maybe less obvious thing, and maybe this only applies to the US, I mean, please tell me this is an irrelevant thought, is that so often now, genuine political education gets replaced by what is then called service education, which I'm not against, okay? Don't jump to conclusions. Very worthwhile things, of course, go out in the community, do something for the community, all very good things, although I dare say, as a footnote, was also very often very instrumental. You know exactly that unless you founded 3 NGOs in Indonesia, you might not get into college in the right place, so also has a nice payoff in other respects. But I don't mean to ridicule it, it can be very good. But in a sense, it's replacing something more political because it's safe, it's apolitical. Nobody's going to disagree with it. Nobody's going to have a problem with it. But it doesn't it doesn't get us into actually practicing politics and practicing real disagreements and clashes of passions and clashes of, if you like, identity and so on and so forth. And it's crowding out the real stuff in a certain way, in a way that's very plausible for many audiences, because they say, oh, it's a good thing if our students go out there and do something for the local community. And they're right, of course. But it shouldn't come at the expense of a more difficult, time-consuming kind of education. And if you add to that the fact that teachers also say, look, in the age of polarization, my classroom might explode. I'm not prepared for a situation when, my students might be really at each other. I have no skills, I have no competence to deal with this. All of a sudden it becomes always safe to do less of it, or to do something that's different, again, something that's very worthwhile, but that can't really be a genuine substitute. And I think this is maybe a more sort of underlying, I mean, it's not the cause of populism, okay? But if you think about what parameters one might change beyond immediate strategies, beyond questions of policy, this is something where one could do a lot more, but it's very difficult. And I think we're not very well prepared to deal with that sort of particular pedagogical challenge. And yet again, I'm not finishing on an uplifting note, but I still hope it was kind of useful.
It was indeed. Thank you very, very much. So much of what you've said and in your responses to the questions we've raised really gives us both some analytical tools through which to unpack what is underway in our democracy. And I think the comparative perspective is also really important. It's easy to get lost in what's happening in your own context and not always look around the world to get a better understanding. So thank you very, very much. It's been an absolute privilege. And thank you to this wonderful audience. See you soon.